Today we're starting a new packet and we're jumping into genetics, which is the next step after reproduction. So if you take a look at the family here, there's kind of a joke at play. So dad's horizontal and mom's shirt has vertical stripes. And since we learned that children from sexually reproducing offspring are a combination of their parents, the kid's got a check shirt. So our I can statements for today, we're really focusing on our genetics terms. We will learn Punnett squares later in the week and genetic crosses a little bit later in the week. We're going to start off with someone named Gregor Mendel, who is considered the father of genetics. Gregor Mendel was a monk, which is like a male nun, who lived in a monastery in Europe in the 1800s. And on the grounds in the garden of the monastery, there were many plants, one of which was pea plants. And Mendel started doing many experiments with the pea plants. And he used pea plants because pea plants had a lot of different traits, and they grew very quickly. So he could do different experiments with the different traits. Mendel's pea plant experiments, where he took different plants that had different physical traits. For instance, some of the pea plants would grow tall and some grew short. Some of the flowers were purple and some were white. Some of the peas were green and some were yellow. And some of the pods were green and some were yellow. And there were even more traits than that. Mendel knew that the plants were probably getting traits from their parents. I know it's odd, but we did talk about how flowering plants do reproduce sexually. So we do have a sperm and an egg. And so the traits, the genes for those traits, came half from the sperm and half from the egg. So Mendel's first experiment was that he took pure short plants. He grew them over and over to make sure they always grew short. And then he took pure tall plants. And again, he grew them over and over and over to where he knew they were only going to grow tall. And so he took the sperm from the short and fertilized the eggs from the tall. And he called that the parent or the pea generation. And once those fertilized and the peas grew, he took the seeds from those peas and he planted them and he let those grow. And he discovered that all of the plants grew tall. There were no short ones. And so that kind of puzzled him because he thought that either they would be half tall, half short, or maybe a medium. He didn't think that they would all be tall. So he did this with various other traits with the peas, and he found out that there was always one trait that showed up and the other one went away. He discovered then that traits could be what are called dominant and recessive. And since all of the plants from that first experiment grew tall, Mendel called tall the dominant trait, and he represented that with a capital T. So in your notebooks where it says big T, you can write the word tall. And then the short trait was the one that was blocked out or that did not show up, and he called that recessive. And he noted that with a lowercase t. So in your booklet, where it has the little t, lowercase, equals, you can write in short. Mendel also, throughout all of these experiments that he did with all of these different traits for the peas, he came up with a couple laws. And the first one he called the law of segregation. And law of segregation states that the allele pairs, so the allele pairs would be like the two forms of the gene or the two gene forms that make up the gene combination for a certain trait, will separate randomly or segregate from each other during the production of gametes or during meiosis. So if you look at the picture, they show that the original cell would have two gene alleles, one from mom, one from dad. In this case, one is a big T for tall and the other is a lowercase t for short. And during meiosis, that big T, little t is going to copy and then divide and divide again. And so that either the sperm or the egg, whichever we're forming here, will get one half of that gene combination. So some will get a big T and some will get a little t. So a sperm or egg will carry only one of the allele from the pair that it inherited it. At fertilization, each gamete or each sex cell will contribute its alleles, giving the offspring a complete set of chromosomes. And what they're saying is that these gene combinations in the original parent cell during meiosis to produce sperm or egg will randomly separate into just one allele for each trait. Mendel's second law is called the law of independent assortment. And the law of independent assortment is going to state that allele pairs will separate independently during meiosis. So traits are transmitted to the offspring independently of one another. So if somebody has blonde hair and blue eyes, it does not mean that both of those will go together and the child will get blonde hair and blue eyes. What it means is that each trait will independently be passed on separate from other traits. The traits are not paired up together. In your drawing of meiosis, in your notes booklet, you'll want to draw in a red and a blue X chromosome, and then half of a red and half of a blue in each of the sex cells. If you do not have red and blue, you can just draw it with your pen or pencil. To give us some examples of Mendel's law of independent assortment, some of these are fictitious examples, kind of things kind of exaggerated. But if we look at that first one, we have neck length is inherited independently from scale color. So scales and neck length do not necessarily go as a pair. They are separate from each other. So just because you have a long neck does not mean you'll have a certain color scale. Height is inherited independently from earlobes. And we're going to, tomorrow we'll look at how you can have free or attached earlobes. So your height is not dependent also upon the type of earlobe. They are separate from each other and are inherited separately from each other. Again, hair color is inherited separately or independently from your eye color. So in your booklet, you'll want to put the little not equals in between each of the pictures, representing that the two traits are not equal to each other. They will be inherited independently or separately from each other. Now we're really going to get into the meat of this lesson, the vocab. We're going to be working with these vocabulary words every day. Part of our assignment today is going to be making these memory game flashcards. So we'll first start with traits. We've talked a lot about traits. Traits are just physical characteristics of an organism. So like height or eye color or hair color, maybe in the peas, if it's tall or short. Heredity, that word heredity is the passing of those traits, those physical characteristics from parent to offspring in your genes. And you'll have to excuse my dog's walking around. You can hear it, or you hear her paws on the floor. Sorry about that. Genetics is going to be the study of heredity. And that's what we'll be doing this whole packet. Genes. We've already talked about this quite a bit. Genes are little segments or pieces of DNA. They're found along the chromosomes and they will control traits. And we haven't gotten into this too much, but you can have different forms of a gene. A slight change in that little sequence of DNA could give you a different form of the gene. For instance, or for example, for eye color, you could have an allele for brown eyes, an allele for green, an allele for blue, an allele for hazel. So the word allele is just talking about the different forms of the gene. If we think about the pea plants we just looked at, we can have an allele for tall, which would be noted with a capital T, and be dominant, or we could have the recessive allele, which would be the lowercase t that represents short. If we say something is pure, or sometimes purebred, it will always produce offspring with the same trait. It will contain two identical gene alleles. Some of you might have a purebred dog or cat. That means that it has papers showing that it has only been bred with the same breed of dog, so it will only produce that same breed. We talked a little bit about the word dominant. A dominant trait or a dominant gene is one that will always show up when at least one gene allele is present. It's the more powerful. Think if you dominate in your sport or you dominate, you're more powerful. The dominant genes will overpower the recessive. So you only need one dominant gene allele for that dominant trait to show up. Where recessive is the trait that is the weaker one. It is covered up or masked by the dominant allele. In order for something to be recessive, it would have to have all recessive gene alleles and no dominant mixed in. A hybrid. If you think of a hybrid car runs on gas and electric. So it's combining two things. If you buy hybrid corn, like corn on the cob, it is a mix of the white and the yellow kernels together. So when we hear the word hybrid, I want you to think of a mix or a combination of two different alleles. In this case, it would be if you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So maybe mom gives you a dominant form of the gene and dad gives you a recessive form of the gene. A hybrid will always show the dominant trait, but it will be carrying that hidden recessive gene. Just like in math, the word probability is the likelihood that a particular event will occur. And then later this week, we'll be looking at Punnett squares. A Punnett square is a chart that shows all of the possible combinations of gene alleles that can result from a genetic cross between sperm and egg. So the Punnett squares can predict the probability or the likelihood that a certain trait or outcome will happen from a particular cross. So if you look at this picture on the screen at the bottom right, we have a hybrid yellow pod parent and a pure recessive green pod parent. So what they're saying is if the egg, for instance, if the mother had a hybrid, half of her eggs would have a big Y and half would have a little y. And if dad was the green pod, then all of his sperm would get the lowercase recessive gene for green pods. And if you look at the chart, it just shows all of the possible ways that the sperm and the egg could come together. And it will also be used to mathematically calculate there's a 50-50 chance of having yellow pods or green pods. The word phenotype is an organism's physical appearance for a trait. So I like to think of this as what does the trait look like when you're looking at it. The word phenotype begins with PH and physical begins with PH. It's a good way to help your brain remember that phenotype is physical appearance. So a phenotype might be blue eyes or brown eyes. Phenotypes could also be tall or short, purple flower, white flower. It's just a physical description of what the trait looks like. A genotype is an organism's genetic makeup or allele combination. A genotype are the actual gene alleles. So I remember that as genotype begins with the word gene, and it's the gene alleles, the actual gene letters that represent those alleles. So if we look up at the picture for the blue eyes, the phenotype is blue eyes, but the genotype is little b, little b. the actual letters that represent the gene alleles. The genotype for the brown eyes would be either big B, little b, or big B, big B. Those letters are representing the gene alleles. And our last two words are homozygous and heterozygous. So let's start with homozygous. The prefix homo means the same. I'm sure you've heard that prefix used, probably inappropriately, but homo means same. So homozygous can either be two dominant alleles, for instance, big B, or it can also be two lowercase alleles, like little b. Homo just means the same. It's a synonym for the word pure or purebred, where hetero means different. So heterozygous would be an organism that has two different gene alleles for a trait. This would be like a big B and a little b. You have two different alleles. This is a synonym for the word hybrid. So heterozygous and hybrid mean the same thing, and homozygous and pure mean the same thing. So if we look above at the Punnett square, it's showing that father is a heterozygous or hybrid, and the mom's genes are also heterozygous or hybrid. However, if you look at what they could produce for offspring, you could get a homozygous dominant big B, and you could also have a chance to have a homozygous recessive little b. But they could also have hybrid or heterozygous big B, little b. I'd like for you to go ahead and use the notes for hybrid and pure, and homozygous and heterozygous, and genotype and phenotype to match all of the following examples to the correct vocabulary words. There will be some that have more than one correct answer. For instance, number 2 could have 2 possible correct answers. And number 6 may have 3 possible correct answers. And we will check this tomorrow. You can also go ahead and do the other practice problem, the multiple choice, and then we'll check it tomorrow. You'll want to use the notes to help you do the assignment of making the genetics vocabulary memory game cards.